Welcome everyone. We're in beautiful Northern California with the new 2017 Porsche 911 Carrera and Carrera S. And this is a 911 Carrera 4S Coupe. We'll get to the differences of the all-wheel drive models in a second. And this is the 2017 911 Carrera S Cabriolet that Vincent has been driving. He'll tell you all about the driving impressions, but we wanted to take the time to go through some of the changes to the technology in this car because many of them are very significant. If we start out at the front, you'll notice the new front fascia of the car. And this is a really interesting detail because these flaps actually move. They close as of 9 miles an hour, and then they open or close depending on the airflow that's needed to cool the car. So anytime the car doesn't need a greater amount of cooling air, these flaps stay closed and reduce the coefficient of drag. So making the car very efficient when it needs to be, but also guaranteeing that the engine gets enough cooling air. Other than that, you have these new sleeker running lights, and in this case, optional LED headlights on the car. And cooling air is a good segue because these cars are now turbocharged. It's a new 3-liter twin-turbo flat-six engine, which means that the car has a lot more torque than the naturally aspirated predecessor. You're talking about 331 foot-pounds of torque from 1700 RPM all the way to 5000 RPM on the standard Carrera models, and 368 foot-pounds of torque in the same RPM range for the Carrera S, 4S, and so on. And just to give you a comparison, the previous Carrera S and Carrera GTS had 325 foot-pounds of torque, so less than the standard car has now, and that happening at a much lower RPM range. What does that mean? That means you get a lot more torque in the low RPM range where you're driving a lot of the time in everyday use, and the car feels a lot more responsive, more thrusty, but at the same time, engine still revs to 7,500 RPM. That's just 300 RPM down from the engine before. It likes to rev. An interesting fact is that the power drop-off between 6,500 RPM, where the engine makes peak power, which is 370 horsepower for the new Carrera, 420 for the S, with bigger compressor wheels in the turbocharger for the S. The power drop-off is only about 5%, so you can still rev it up to redline where it makes power. It doesn't feel sluggish up there. It doesn't lose a lot of power like some other turbo engines. And that's really, really important. That was one of the key things that they focused on in development, is making this car very responsive and not feel like a big laggy turbo engine. The other big question is obviously the sound. Vincent can tell you more about how we did with that, but both of these cars have the optional sport exhaust, and I can tell you from my perspective, they sound great. They still have a very characteristic flat-six sound that's enjoyable, and it's all natural. We don't pipe any sound through loudspeakers into the interior. It's just a membrane that basically uses the air oscillations the intake makes to accentuate the sound in the best way possible. But it's, if you will, an all-natural organic sound, and it sounds great. Both cars, both engine variants come in coupe, cabriolet, and targa form. We don't have a Targa here, but this is the Cabriolet. It's got a soft top roof that you can operate at speeds of up to 31 miles an hour, and it takes about 10, 12, 13 seconds to retract. And it's very convenient, the fact that you can do it on the go. You know, you get into a little rain shower or something, you can slow down a bit and not have to stop on the side of the road. The other thing that's interesting about having these two cars next to each other is this is a 4S. In this case, 4 stands for our all-wheel drive system, and the 4S models can be identified by the wider rear end. The rear end is about 1.7 inches wider than that of the two-wheel drive Carrera and Carrera S. And the other distinguishing feature of the 4 models, Carrera 4 and Carrera 4S, is this light strip that wraps all the way around the rear of the car, which that car, being a two-wheel drive, as you can see, does not have. So that's how you identify a 4S. Another interesting fact about the all-wheel drive models is they have the all-wheel drive system from the 911 Turbo now, which is electro-hydraulic. It's more responsive, it can transfer torque more quickly. That was very important on these cars because they're making more power, they're making more torque. And because of this new system, For the first time, the all-wheel drive models are actually faster to 60 than the rear-wheel drive models. They used to be the same because the better traction of the system was compensated by the extra weight, and because the rear engine car already has very good traction offhand. But with this new system being able to transfer torque between the two axles even more efficiently and quickly, these cars actually make up a bit of time compared to the rear-wheel drive car to 60. So let's talk about 0 to 60. This is essentially the quickest non-911 turbo 911. Carrera 4S with the new twin-turbo engine, PDK, Sport Chrono all-wheel drive, does 0 to 60 in 3.6 seconds. And the Carrera S with the same transmission setup, 3.7 as a coupe, and the cabs are about 0.2 of a second slower, so that with the PDK and Sport Chrono in that case would be 3.9. The standard model ranges from 4 seconds to 4.4, and 3.9 seconds for a Carrera 4 PDK Sport Chrono. So a lot of numbers, but the more important thing is really the torque on these cars. They make the car very responsive, very lively in any rev range really, and it's just a blast to drive. Let's talk about some of the suspension changes, because obviously if we're going up in power, then we need to do something about brakes, we need to do something about suspension. These are S's, and this is one of the bigger brake changes that we did. So the previous car had a 340 millimeter rotor, a single piece rotor. The new S has a two-piece rotor, which means that the rotor is connected to a brake bell that can dissipate heat a lot bigger, and the rotor is also larger at 350 millimeters, so it's 10 mil or about 0.43 inches up in diameter from the previous car. And I've seen pictures of these things glowing red hot, stock brake fluid, and they're still fine. So really a step up in brake performance. All Carreras now have adaptive suspension, so adaptive dampers standard, which we refer to as Porsche Active Suspension Management. And that includes a 10 millimeter drop in ride height compared to the previous standard car that didn't have any active dampers. This car has the optional PASM Sport suspension, which features an additional 10 mil drop, so the car has a lower center of gravity, it's lower to the road, and a more aggressive calibration for performance-oriented drivers. And a little tidbit that separates the two that you can see quite well here because we have them next to each other is with a more aggressive sport suspension, you get a more pronounced front spoiler lip. You can see how it extends further than that one. And correspondingly, the rear spoiler on those cars also goes up at different angles to create a bit more downforce. So overall, the whole aerodynamics package and suspension package of PASM Sport is geared more towards performance. And these being S models, they both have it. Vincent will also probably tell you about what it feels like to drive. The S models can be equipped with rear axle steering. What is rear axle steering? Rear axle steering uses active toe actuators at the rear axle that, depending on the speed and driving situation, either steer the rear wheels counter to what the front wheels are doing, effectively reducing the turning radius, making turn and sharper, the car more agile. The amount of steering angle you need to put in to go around a corner is reduced significantly. And at higher speeds, above 50 miles an hour, they steer in tandem, so essentially in the same direction as the front wheels, and that gives the car a lot more stance, stability at higher speeds. So a great system that enhances performance, but also, for example, reduces the turning circle by about 1.6 feet. So it's really a useful feature for every day just as much as on the track. And that was a feature that we offered as standard in the 918 Spider, the 911 GT3 and GT3 RS, the 911 Turbo models, and it's now trickled down to the 4S models, Targa 4S models as an option. You can get it as a standalone option. You can also opt for the Sport package, which includes the rear axle steering, includes Sport Chrono, includes these Sport design mirrors with a V-shaped base, and it also includes the Sport exhaust, which can be identified by those two central tailpipes that we were looking at a little while ago, and the GT Sport steering wheel, which has a bit smaller diameter than the regular steering wheel. It's a bit grippier, which brings us to the interior. And there's some significant changes there as well. So if we open up this 4S we have here with the saddle brown interior and brushed aluminum trim, we can see the GT Sport steering wheel in this case, and grips nicely. And the car also has our new mode switch. When you order cars with Sport Chrono package, the buttons like Sport and Sport Plus are no longer here in the center console. They are housed in this mode switch right here. So you're driving along and you have the option of switching it to Sport, Sport Plus, and this is new. Individual allows you to basically customize your performance settings. So if you go into the menu here, and you can go into the individual setting and basically determine if I'm driving, what do I usually like to do. So let's just say I want to go with Sport. This is Sport Exhaust, but I want the softer damper setting, so I'm not going to click this. And then every time I go to individual, it will recall the settings I stored. So I basically have my preferred setting outside of the 3 default modes in one particular place. And on cars with PDK, which this car has, the dual clutch transmission, which is optional. Standard transmission on all these cars is still a 7-speed manual, so we still have that. But if you get PDK and you have Sport Chrono, the Sport Response button is part of that package. So what that is you press it once regardless of the mode you're in, it doesn't matter, and it calibrates transmission and engine to offer the maximum amount of performance acceleration for 20 seconds. And when you activate that, so it'll downshift, do a really aggressive transmission strategy and all that, and it'll count down in that timer for 20 seconds, letting you know how much longer you still have that available power and thrust. And once you're done using it, you can either click it off by just pressing the button again, or when it runs out, it'll revert back to the mode that you were in before. And you can use it as often as you want. So it's you could call it like a kind of a push to pass mode, where you're following a truck and you see room to pass, you just flick it in that and you know the car will give you the maximum amount of acceleration, which is good to have in a passing situation. One final big change on the car, other than the steering wheel with the mode switch, if you get Sport Chrono, which we just talked about, is the new navigation system. Those of you familiar with the Porsche navigation system will know that up to now, the screen was kind of recessed into the dash frame here. This one now has a glass cover, so it's a lot flusher in terms of integration. And there's a reason for that, because this is a more advanced touchscreen. So we're looking at the map right here. This can be operated like a smartphone, so you can kind of scroll and pinch and pull the map like this. You can still operate it normally the way you could before, but it's just a lot more intuitive. And the system does also offer Apple CarPlay capability, Wi-Fi, real-time traffic information. So a much more advanced system with a lot more capabilities. Really a step up from the system before, and making the car a lot more usable day to day. And then finally, one other option that we did not offer on the Carreras before, we did offer it on the GT3 and GT3 RS, is the front axle lift system, which is the button right here. And what that does is it raises the front end of the car by about 1.5 inches, measured at the front spoiler lip. And that's really useful, especially if you have the sport suspension like on this with a fairly low ride height, to negotiate over curbs and speed bumps, driveways, things like that. The system will, or the front end rather, will stay up to about 37, 38 miles an hour, and then it'll drop back down, or you can drop it back down manually. But that's a very useful feature if you're ordering the car, you have a steep driveway or a lot of speed bumps, and you want to make sure that you don't scratch up that nice front spoiler. So that pretty much sums up most of the new technology in this car, and I'm sure Vincent will fill you in terms of all the driving experiences. But thanks for watching.